Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel, and I'm doing a bit of a movie review of sorts. I recently saw The Ark and the Darkness, a 2-day special event in theaters, and I went to my local theater to see this. And what I want to do here is I want to talk about my experience having seen this movie. I will get into some of the details of like what's, the content of the movie itself and how it presents the story of Noah's Ark and the evidence for the, I'll call it the 20th century sort of traditional perspective on Noah's Ark and the book of Genesis. And so we'll go into some detail there, and that's gonna take me a while. But if you don't want to stick around for all of that, what I'm going to do is I'm front loading this particular video with sort of the nuts and bolts of what this movie or documentary was, a little bit about who's behind it, some of my overall general impressions of the film, right? My takeaways from it. All right, so I'll give you my big takeaways right up front, try to dispense with that, and then I'll get to the details. We'll kind of go through the whole movie. I've got a series of screenshots, and then I'll talk about the major pieces of evidence that were mentioned and how they were talked about. And we'll do a little bit of critiquing of that, but we're not going to go like super in depth. This isn't like an all out, like complete assessment of this movie and every single claim in it. I mean, that would take many, many hours. And we want to try to keep this to some reasonable amount of time, this video to some reasonable amount of time. Like I said, I'm going to try to sort of like hit the highlights here in the first 15 to 20 minutes of this video. All right, you ready? Let's check out The Ark and the Darkness. So where to begin? I've been hearing about this particular film because it's been in production for a year or two, and they've been asking for donations, right? This is a crowdsourced thing along with I'm sure some other money that comes behind it. This is not, from what I saw from the crowdsourcing, couldn't possibly have paid for this entire film the way it was produced. And so it's been in development for a long time. It was back in 2021 that Answers in Genesis had a short article on their website. I think ICR actually mentioned as well. So these are two large creation science ministries, and who mentioned it and told their supporters about it, and basically gave a bit of a like, hey, this might be something worth supporting, even though this is not a Answers in Genesis production. Now, there are Answers in Genesis employees that are being interviewed as part of this, but there's a number of other people outside that organization. So this movie is not a Answers in Genesis production. It's an independent young Earth creationist film. Here are a couple of the advertisements for it, right? In theaters, March 20th and 21st. I'd been bombarded on my Facebook and Twitter accounts with like, get your tickets now. It's going to sell out. You need to get them soon. 2 weeks, I'd say probably 2-3 weeks before it, I went and to make sure I got a seat, only to discover that in my local theater, not a single seat had been sold. So I thought, maybe it's not going to be that much of maybe it's not going to be that much of a phenomenon, right? However, when I went to try to get a ticket 2 days before the showing, I discovered that the 2 showings from Thursday night, the 21st, were almost sold out. I'd have to sit in the front seat. But fortunately, they opened up 4 more showings that evening. So eventually there were 6 showings on the 21st. So they kept opening more and more and more showings as those theaters filled up. So there was some demand for it. I suspect these are church groups. In large part, I saw several large groups. I came early to the theater. I like to get a feeling for the response to things like this. So I showed up about a half hour early before the other 2 showings were to start, sort of stood around and waited and saw the people coming in to see like what sort of people are coming to watch this film. What are they talking about? Are they anticipating it and so forth? And, overheard conversations that were mostly like, hey, yeah, I'm looking forward to watching this movie. And I heard several people talking about how like their church group was coming, or, their pastor had recommended they come see this film. So that's your audience, your typical audience for this movie. So this movie comes to you from a group called Genesis Apologetics. and this Sevenfold Films, which is just the name of the film company that's that's working with Genesis apologetics. The subline is unearthing the mysteries of Noah's flood. And as we're going to see in a little while, I mean, yes, there's a good portion of this film that's devoted to showing, all right, trying to show you and give you a feel for what Noah's flood, this cataclysmic event that covered the waters covering the entire earth. But this film is a lot more than just the flood, as we'll see. And the point is, as it says here, the point of the movie is one single point. Noah's flood actually happened. Now, the larger point is people didn't listen prior to the flood, to the warnings, right? The world was in chaos. The world was evil everywhere, right? And that's why this flood had to come as a consequence of man's action. And so it is a condemnation of man. It's a punishment of all people on earth. And ultimately, the warning of the movie is that the second punishment for all people is coming. And really strongly emphasized in this movie is that punishment's coming very, very soon. You know, like within our lifetime type of feel you get from this movie. And that if people didn't listen way back in Noah's time, and people aren't listening now. So as in the days of Noah, right? According to 2 Peter, right? As in the days of Noah, right? We forgot the lessons learned. That's the big overarching theme of this feature. Oh yeah, I already mentioned this, but I already talked about the theaters, but I ended up in the third showing sitting in the second row. And although most of the seats were sold, there were a few empty seats, but actually pretty impressive. I'd say 400 or 500 people that evening came to that theater to see this film. Certainly more. I'm sure that was more people saw this film. It was a busier night for that theater, being a Thursday night, than it would have been without this film. Right? I'm sure that 500 people is probably twice as many as saw all the other films combined being showed at a fairly large theater. So who is the main impetus? Who's really behind this thing? It would be Dr. Daniel Biddle. And he is the founder and director of this organization called Genesis Apologetics. So he's got another young earth creationist ministry. They do a lot of video stuff, all right, rather than writing articles and so forth. They do a lot of video teaching. So they produce homeschool curriculum and so forth, of course, very much with this young earth creationist foundation. So you can see here that Daniel Biddle is a behavioral scientist, or he calls himself a behavioral scientist. He has his doctorate in psychology, or industrial or organizational psychology. And he's been doing this creation science ministry stuff for a long time. I've seen a number of his videos. In fact, I've even commented on several of them on my YouTube channel. He's not I wouldn't say he's certainly not a major player in the sense that you have your Answers in Genesis, your Institute for Creation Science, and you have your Creation Ministries International, which sort of gobble up the majority of donors' dollars and have the largest impact, and they're the most visible. But Daniel Biddle has carved himself out quite a niche within the young earth creationist world. And so I wanted to show you about one thing about sort of the flavor of this, because many of you who watch me in this channel or know about young earth creationists know that young earth creationist organizations, there's a reason why there's not one monolithic organization. It's because they don't all agree on all the tenets of young earth creationism. They all have some foundational core beliefs that are the same, but they very much disagree when it comes to some specific interpretations. I'm saying that because this particular film is going to present a particular viewpoint of young earth creation, a particular interpretation of the flood, which is not going to be agreed upon 100% by all young earth creationists. And the film portrays everything. Well, the film portrays everything very confidently, as if this is what happened. This is all. This must be. This is what there's no qualification. There's no feeling at all that there is any room for differences of opinion on matters. Right? It's a very confident film, put it that way. And also we'll get into it later, but the eschatology, all right, the views of the end times come from a particular perspective, and it's pervasive throughout the film. And not everyone who comes to this film is going to feel at ease with that, feeling like, the pairing of a particular viewpoint of Noah's flood and then pairing that with a particular view of the end times. Because that's a central theme in the film, is how you view what happened at Noah's time. Well, we're in the second Noah. All right, this is the times right before Noah are the times that we're in now. That's a particular that is an interpretation of Revelation and again, eschatological views of the future. What are the end times going to be like? And if you know anything about Christian theology, you'll know that there are multiple different end times views, which enjoy various levels of support. And so that is one thing that not all Christians agree upon. So I put this up here because Dan Biddle, his organization has this kind of statement about how they fit into the grander scheme of Young Earth Creationist Ministries. We provide practical and easy to understand video, web, written products for pastors, parents, and students. The materials provided will be those of the core of the creationist position. See, they don't develop ideas. Like, they're not developing new hypotheses. They're not testing things. They're not doing like the creation science that some people think of as like creation science, like scientists who are trying to figure out how to interpret the scriptures within and interpret the evidence of the world within their interpretation of scriptures. No, they're taking the work that other organizations have done, like Institutes for Creation Research, which are like the primary ones that do some form of research. And then you have Answers in Genesis, and you have Creation Ministries International, and so forth, sort of the thinkers in Young Earth Creationism. And they take their ideas and kind of say what's common to all of those, what is sort of agreed upon among those hypotheses. And that's, to them, the core of the creationist position. And so they use that in their materials as they make videos and promote it and help to, I guess you could say, they're disseminating Young Earth Creationist information. Right? They're not creating the creationist content in that way, or the original ideas. And as he says here, we generally avoid fringe evidences that are controversial between these and other creationist associations. I don't think they do a very good job of abiding by that policy, because I find that Dan Biddle's videos include a large amount of what I would consider fringe ideas. I think that he is too easily taken in by any piece of evidence that sounds really good. And this movie demonstrates that. I mean, there are strong statements made about things that are factually incorrect that I know that many other Young Earth creationists would disagree are even facts, but are presented as factual information in this particular film. So I like the sentiment that's suggested on their website, but I don't think that they're very good at following through with this at times. And boy, we're really going to get a heavy dose of the eschatological stuff. And there might be some, I would say that many Young Earth creationists are of a particular eschatological persuasion, but certainly not all of them. Certainly not all of them. So that would be an area where I think they should have not played up the eschatology so much in this particular film. Okay, so what does the film do? All right, ostensibly it seeks to provide evidence. All right, so at its core, but I'm going to say out of the 2 hours of this documentary, maybe I'll say 50 to 60 minutes, so about half of it, is a presentation of argumentation, all right, arguments for and evidence for a global flood. Not so much evidence for a young Earth, all right, that's kind of just basically a given coming into the theater to its audience. It's just like, we're not going to try to convince you the Earth is young. We're going to convince you that a global flood happened. And really, this is a bit of a strategy in the sense that there's a and Ken Ham does this too. You know, if you can convince somebody that the flood is global, and if you can believe that, the evidence for that, then you're highly likely to believe that the world is young too, because you're going to apply the same forms of logic that get you to a global flood. It's going to also get you to a global, a young Earth, right, and young universe on top of that for young age creationist. I'm trying to say young age creationist, by the way, more. I'm trying to keep telling myself I need to say that instead of young Earth creationist, because it's not just about the Earth being young; it's also about the universe being young. Of course, there are a few creationists that believe the universe is old and the Earth is young, but you know, we can't encompass all creationists in one term. And so I already mentioned pervasive dispensational premillennial perspective. Actually, I didn't mention that. I just said pervasive eschatology, but this is the particular eschatological approach that is presented in the film. And I can talk more about that later, but in its simplest sense, it's the idea that most dispensational premillennialists are looking at the world as a place that's running down, right? You know, the world is started out perfection, and then it was ruined again by the flood and sort of restarted, you know, with Noah and his family. But really, ever since then, it's been in a state of decay. And there's going to be a lot of talk in this film about genetic entropy, about decay, about falling apart, about everything going bad. And there's really very little hope that any of that can be improved in our present world, in our present age. So there's very little we can do about it to save this world, because this world is doomed to destruction. It's going to be burnt up in fire, right? And there's mentions in this film of 2 Peter and a particular interpretation of that. And so it's views the world as being in the last days, just like in Noah's days. And what we're waiting for is just to be taken out, right? We're ready to just be lifted out of this world. And that moment could be at any moment. And that's the urgency of this film and the message in the last few minutes. Before I go too far off on the eschatological thing, because honestly, that was one of the things that struck me the most as I watched the film. I came in kind of knowing what to expect in terms of the creation science. I could have guessed 75% of the content of the film in terms of like the types of evidence that they were going to promote, although I was a little surprised by how stridently, how much they pushed certain forms of evidence. And I'll get to that later when we start going through some of the actual arguments themselves. But back to the origins of this film and who's making it, like who's represented in the movie. And I took this screenshot here at the end. Oh, actually, maybe this was right at the beginning. We had the guest speakers. And let me just go through those real quickly here. We have John Baumgartner, who's an independent researcher and is somewhat associated with Liberty University. There's two main places the sources for the experts, all right? The experts that are going to be on the screen, like their faces are going to be on the screen, right? So these are the people that have the authority to speak to the audience. And they're from Liberty University and from Answers in Genesis. So you have John Baumgartner, associated with Liberty. You have Tim Chafee, associated with Answers in Genesis. Andrew Fabbage, I can't remember if he's associated with Liberty or not, because there's a couple independent independent folks as well. Can't say scientists because some of these are theologians. Gabrielle Hayes, paleontologist associated with Answers in Genesis. So you notice these are all doctors, right? So very, very heavy emphasis on like we have PhD level folks that are coming at you and telling you the truth in this particular video. We got Mark Horstemeyer. I think he's associated with Liberty. I should have looked that one up. I don't know him at all. And then you have Charles Jackson, who's kind of like his own independent thing. All right, he's has his own creation science ministry, and he's a very dynamic guy. I like him. He's fun. He adds a lot of joy to the show because he's funny, and but boy, he's very strident too. He has some of the strongest statements in terms of the how awesome the story of young Earth creationism is, and how well it explains the data, and how the evolutionists are completely out to lunch. And yeah, I'll wait. We'll get to him, get to Charles Jackson and some of his, I think, pretty outrageous statements. But I can't help but smile when I see him because he's enjoying himself, much more so than the fairly grim look that many of the other speakers have in this film. And then we got Terry Mortensen, also from Answers in Genesis. Randall Price, who's I think Liberty University. You've got John Sanford, another independent young Earth creationists out there, and he's the big one behind the genetic entropy thing. Got Andrew Snelling, that's geologist from Answers in Genesis. And you got Carl Werner, who's also another independent. And so so Dan Biddle, who's sort of behind all this, and sort of wrote the book that goes along with this. He is collecting. These are people that he are in his sphere, and some I'm sure he invited that he probably doesn't know that well, but he wanted to be involved. But mostly people he's comfortable within sort of this sphere outside the major young Earth creationist organizations. All right, so that's your I'll call it the motley crew of presenters in this show. All right, so I'm just going to go in the order of I put things in here, even though I've already way off of my my script. Back to the eschatological thing. So Answers in Genesis and ICR both wrote recommendations for people to go see this film. One thing happens, I haven't mentioned yet is, a number of years back, there was a film called Is Genesis History? And that was also done in the same format, sort of an independently produced film, bringing together a number of different young Earth creation scientists from different organizations. So kind of saying like, hey, here I've collected people representing the young Earth creationist community. And they built a film, Is Genesis History, to look at is Genesis history, meaning, and it was a supporting young Earth and global flood in that case. And that the way that film was promoted again was they got it into theaters as sort of I don't remember if it was a Fathom event, but it was a 1 or 2 day event. And it was a very large event. They did a very good job of promoting it, getting churches and people to come to that. Theaters were pretty much packed for that thing. And then eventually released on video, and then they made a bunch of associated materials with it. Well, that's the same thing that's going to happen here. They're taking the same model of Is Genesis History and making yet another young Earth creationist movie that hopefully can make a bigger splash. And I think that they view it as a gospel outreach. It's not just for people in the church. This movie is very much tried to present as you could be kind of naive about the whole young Earth creationism thing and come to this film and get the entire gospel message from it. So that's the other, really super overarching theme of the film is it is from the beginning to the end all of redemptive history. Well, their particular interpretation of redemptive history. So anyway, back to Answers in Genesis. They did, Ken Ham did write something about like, yes, we recommend this film. After all, we've got like 4 people that are my employees are actually speaking in this film. So I can't very well not recommend it, but they do have to note, right? There's a segment on eschatology at the end of the movie, right? However, Answers in Genesis is a non-denominational organization. We do not endorse any particular eschatological system, but we do endorse the contents of this movie with regards to Noah's flood. In other words, we approve of what's being said about Noah's flood and the evidence that's presented, because it's going to be our speakers that are going to be presenting that evidence. Our speakers aren't going to be talking about eschatology, for the reason that we don't take an eschatological viewpoint as an organization. Now, my response to this is that Answers in Genesis takes positions on a bazillion things, right? They try to answer all questions from the Bible, all questions you may have, unless you have a question about end times, right? Then you don't ask that because we can't tell you from the Bible. No, I think it's really, we know that we have an audience that has divergent viewpoints on this, and so in this case, we're not going to take a position because we don't want to turn off anyone. Personally, I think that the viewpoint that is presented in the film is not far off from what many people in most young Earth organizations probably ascribe to. However, they have a much larger audience than simply the ones that work for these organizations. And they know that there's a good segment of it that is amillennial and especially post-millennial in their eschatology. And so they didn't want to. So he's basically warning. It's like, okay, there's going to be this eschatological umbrella over this entire film that we may or may not agree with. All right, so a few other tidbits before we just go like right into like, I'm just going to go right through the whole thing because I took copious notes as I was watching the film, which was hard because, man, it was a dark film. I don't mean like dark, like as in the sense of like gloomy and, well, really, I guess it was because, it was constantly harping on how horrible the world is. It's like, I mean, it was obviously horrible before the flood, and I'm going to show you a couple images of just how, like, well, I'm not going to show you the images of like child sacrifice and things like that before the flood. Apparently, that was going on, even though again, lots of stuff that was suggested in the film that nowhere is found directly in the Bible. So quite an imagination is part of this film. And then all talking about the end times that are happening today, and lots of stuff about the present society and the decay of society and how everything is much worse today than it was, 50 years ago or 200 years ago. And so there is that sense of darkness. I just mean that most of the images in the film are kind of dark. I mean, it's a dark background with the speakers when their faces are on the screen. And then most of the film is, it's raining and it's like, so I was literally sitting in the dark. So I'm writing notes and I can't even see what I'm writing half the time. So I just told myself, write really big. My notebook, I should have taken a picture of my notebook. I could have showed you. It's like, I've got like 6 sentences per page, so I have the possibility that I'll be able to read my notes, which is tough because my writing is terrible these days with handwriting. But before we go through the entire movie, I said that I would, try to get out all of my major points before I get to that. So let's just talk about some of my other impressions. As I said, theater was pretty full. I was sitting in the second row. I had people on both sides of me, and I had a couple sitting next to me. They had this huge tub of popcorn. They were laying back, in the lounge seats, and they came in late, and the flood has already begun, and they're just like, "Wow, this is like amazing!" And it's like the entire show, like for the next hour and 45 minutes. Every 45 seconds to a minute. Wow, I didn't know that. That's amazing. Like every time they showed like some piece of evidence, it's like, that's really cool evidence. I didn't know that. I gotta remember that. And it was it was kind of eye opening to me because you're just somebody that doesn't have any knowledge of science at all, and every single thing shown on the screen was like incredibly impactful to them. Like they was just like, I can't believe that people don't know, that people actually believe anything other than this because it's so obviously true. That's the thing about this film. If you don't know anything about scientific evidence, you don't know anything about the age of the earth and the evidence for or against the age of the earth, and you just come to this film, it's going to hit you like a ton of bricks because there's no equivocation here. This is like, why? I'm not quite to the film yet, but I will tell you what the very first thing that comes up on the screen is when there's actual speaking. There's an opening scene. And then after this opening scene that sort of dramatically gives you an idea of the flood, sort of a preview of the flood beginning, you go to this question, why don't people believe? I mean, here's this giant flood, and we're just showing you like what this flood could have looked like. And the question is, why don't people believe? That's the first thing that's being asked. And the answer is because people don't have access to the evidence. People haven't heard the evidence, right? And that's what this film's for. We're going to present you the evidence. So you haven't been presented it. You don't see it in all the other places that you don't see it on social media. You don't see it in your schools. You don't see it in the library. You don't see it in the museums that you go to, right? And so because you haven't seen it, that's why people don't believe. And simply, if you saw the evidence, then you would believe. Now, what are you going to be confronted with for the next 2 hours? The evidence, right? The thing that you haven't been seeing, the thing that's been covering your eyes for your whole life. We're now going to unveil the evidence that's being suppressed. right? So that's what you're getting right at the very beginning is you have been fooled, and we're here to reveal the truth. Okay, let's go back. All right, we'll get into that later. The audience was average age of probably 60, and I walked into 3 different theaters um, showings just to look around. So this is definitely sort of an older audience. Definitely like you just get well, I would say independent Baptist type audience, and I say that because there was a lot of clapping and a lot of cheering at different points and a lot of commenting. And definitely at the end, there wasn't a standing ovation in my theater, but there was a rousing bit of clapping going on. Right? People were like, "Yeah, all right, that was great." Some hallelujahs, So it was. It wasn't a staid, conservative Presbyterian audience that was in the room. I'll just put it that way. But the animation was, I think, pretty good. Now, here's what they did to save money. You'll see clips of this, and they'll look really great, all right, because they're going to show you where they put a lot of money, which is in like the some images of the how the flood began, and then a little bit at the end of the flood, and then a few other areas. All right, so there's some extended scenes that are fairly high quality, like I would say, like right up there with a lot of stuff you see in the theater. I mean, I think a lot of stuff you see in the theater really isn't that great of sort of animation. It was still highly pixelated. Of course, I'm sitting right in front of the screen too, so I'm seeing all the pixels there. So it wasn't very smooth. So it could have been like higher resolution. There's definitely films out there that are far higher resolution. So that's a processing power thing, and that's a money thing too. So what happened is the rest of it's sort of this clouded. It's animated, but you can tell what it is they've filmed things, real film, and then they've taken that and they've digitized it in a way, and then used programs in order to sort of animate that film, and that is in low quality, and it's meant to look low quality. It's sort of like it's like a style, right? And so that all is like, I can't really quite make out what that is. I get the idea of what's happening here, but everything's kind of glistening. Lots of scenes kind of have like what looks like a water overlay over the top, like you're kind of looking through water. And that's kind of gets you the idea, because you're supposed to feel like you're in the flood the entire thing. I mean, you really do kind of feel like that's part of the darkness feeling of the overall ambiance of the movie is you're in a dark theater and everything's watery and murky. You kind of almost feel like you're underwater. All right. So that sensation of like, I don't want to, right? You don't want to be in the next flood, right? You don't want to be in the situation where those who are outside the ark, which is the situation you're almost in right now, right? Because the world is going to be destroyed. And you want to be, as Charles Jackson says near the end, you want to be on the winning team, right? So I want to be on the winning team. I don't want to be on the losing team. Who wants to be a loser? Right? So, I mean, literally, that's what he says. Right? You want to be on the winning team. Don't be on this loser team and be like this dinosaur outside the ark. Okay, film not nearly as good as is Genesis History, right? I saw Is Genesis History in the theater. I thought this is going to be a really important film for the Young Earth Creationist ministry. This is a very serious film with serious actors. Actors being the narrators, those that are being interviewed, and they came across as real PhDs that used a little bit higher level language, and so it gave you the sense they really knew what they're talking about. I could tell you there was a lot of colloquial sort of, I don't want to call it Southern speak, but it was just kind of like there was a heavy accent to the narrator, and it was very kind of like, we're kind of have a conversation, except that my conversation is telling you what you should believe, but almost like a preacher. like maybe that's more of the sense. It was a very preachy type of thing, whereas I didn't get the sense of preachiness in Is Genesis History so much. There were many points where it just felt like over the top and kind of like overly dramatic narration. So in that sense, I found it to be not nearly as good as Is Genesis History. However, this might be more effective because, as we all know, the stronger you are, the more you say this is what you have to believe, the more success you have with much of your audience who might be ignorant of and unable to really critique what they're seeing. I don't know how to put that more politely. All right. The other thing in the film was no hint at all anywhere that many young Earth creationists would disagree with some of the points that are made in the film. I'm sure they tried to like represent the core of young Earth creationist beliefs, but on the other hand, there's still points in this film where they're so over the top strong on like what this means. But I know other young Earth creationists who would disagree with that interpretation. And as I hinted before, there's some points where young Earth creationists would say that's not even right. That's not even factually right, or that's not fair. You're misrepresenting the other side. And that would be the only part I was kind of a little bit offended by. Was there are points in the film where it's like, this is what you're told you have to believe. And I'm like, no, that's not at all, right? That is a caricature, right? A constant building of caricatures. And then, oh, look, we got this other evidence. Oh, look how stupid this other opinion is, right? But that's not really what other people are saying, including many, many other Christians. And the whole two sides thing, that also was played up at the end. There was like, you've got two choices, right? There's two sides. You can either be on this side or you can be on this side. And it really is the side of light and the side of dark, right? Those are your two options. You have to believe everything that was in this film, or you're going to be like these folks outside of the ark, right? The door, you're seeing the doors closing, right? Are you going to be on the inside or are you going to be on the outside of that door? Right? These are constant images throughout the film of the stark choice that everyone is forced to make when they enter into that theater. Now, my last impression before we get into the details is something that has hit me every time I watch a film like this. Because there's been one film after another. It's not just Is Genesis History. There's been 4 or 5 like theater quality films that have been produced to try to support this particular reading of Genesis. And what hits me every time I watch them is every time someone tries to show in even more detail than the previous film, this is how it happened. It seemed, in my mind, it becomes less real. Right? It becomes less likely, right? Every time they try to paint that picture, it becomes, to me, more ridiculous because it highlights how difficult it is to actually manipulate the data into a perspective where you're going to explain the world's geology based on a global flood. It's like when you just talk about in generalities, this could have happened. There's a lot of water and it creates different layers. But then when you start to talk about specific layers and try to talk about specific fossils and specific things, and you try to apply that general theory to it, and then act like it's, look how amazing this is, that it fits the evidence. The more you dig down into the details, the less it makes sense, right? So it's almost like, I find this happens to a lot of things in life, right? You have this big idea or this big hypothesis, or you have this particular belief about how some system works, but you don't know much about it. And then once you get into the details, you're like, oh, this is a whole lot more complex, right? It's more nuanced, right? There's all these other things I never knew about, and the picture is a lot less murky. And this is where people talk about, I'm going to use the word deconstruction. It's like you have an idea. I think even all Christians at one time when they're growing up, they've been taught something in a very simple sense, because when you're a kid, you're not ready for the details, and then you have to go through a period where you see more detail, and you have to make sense of that you have to have a more complex theory in order to explain all the data, and you need to sort through that. Sometimes you have to get rid of some of your original ideas in order to replace them with better ideas. And I feel like, younger creationism sometimes is this big idea that's kind of like, when you read the Genesis flood, it's like these big, huge pictures, right? This could have happened, this, and you'd have a flood and water receded and stuff got sorted out, and but without actually looking at a lot of details. And then now what has young earth creation done is had 50 years to try to figure out details. Well, the more they get into the details, it's just like every detail creates 5 new problems. Like everything you try to solve to try to fix a particular problem, and this is going to show up in the film, okay, we're trying to solve this, we're trying to explain this particular thing that you've observed, a real observation, a real fact in the world. And when we explain that, I think of like 50 other things that, because you just tried to explain it that way, you just created 50 other problems, right? 50 other pieces of data I know about now no longer fit into that explanation. And so the more somebody tries to show me the details, the less realistic the whole thing becomes. That's only if you really have a lot of knowledge, right? A lot of evidence, and you know a lot of the other facts. Most of the viewers of this film are coming in there, and they're going to be like the people that sat around me, right? They don't know anything, right? And I'm not saying they're dumb people. They simply don't have knowledge of like specific things about, geological concepts, which is fine. They know a bunch about other things. They just don't know that much about this, and they never thought about it. Most people don't really sit around and think about origins. They don't think about how we determine time, and these are more I don't want to say esoteric. These aren't things that are part of people's daily life. Spit that out. So yeah, they come in with kind of a blank slate, and they've heard some things. And, most of them have been to museums. They've heard about millions of years. Right? See, that's why Ken Ham said, you've heard about millions of years. They don't know the details of that. And so here they're being presented with, that's a silly idea, that millions of years. Look how obvious it is, because we're going to show you like 3 types of evidence. We'll go through those 3 pieces of evidence. 3 things that make it blatantly obvious that the world must be very young. And therefore, whatever else you've heard has to be wrong. And all you have to remember are these 3 pieces of evidence, because they absolutely contradict an ancient earth. And since these things can't fit an ancient earth, the earth has to be young. And so all you have to do is just believe that everything else, we can figure out a way. If we just have enough time, if we have enough evidence. And in this film, it's mentioned many times, we don't really have that much, we don't have as much money as the evolutionists do, right? And there aren't as many of us. But if there were more of us and we had more money, give us more donations, give us more money, we'll figure it out. Because we just gave you the basic evidence that shows that the earth is young, right? And the global flood happened. And so all we have to do now is just figure out all the rest of the details, and we'll be good. Thanks for getting this far. At least you got some sense at least for my thoughts, on this particular film. Now, I'm sure I've forgotten a bunch of things that I was going to say. I wrote a few notes out for myself, but I'll remember a lot of the things as I go forward. But you got the basic gist of my impressions of the film. I think that it will be something that will be shown in a lot of church basements here over the next year. And it's going to leave an indelible mark on a lot of people because it's an effective witness tool. It really is. I disagree with the eschatology. I disagree with the types of evidence presented. I think that some of it's factually wrong. I think interpretively it's utterly wrong in many areas, right? So I have a lot of disagreements with the film, but I recognize that for a large portion of the intended audience, this is going to be a very effective and powerful feeling movie, right? It's going to leave a mark in someone's memory and their consciousness so much more than anything else that they've heard. So this is why these types of films are made. This kind of film can influence and persuade far more people than a whole bunch of creation research and publications in journals and things like that, right? These are the people that are bringing the young earth creationist message to the masses. And it's the masses that really then will demand what they want to hear in the church, right? What they expect their pastors to say, what they expect their youth leaders to say, and so forth. And so even if a pastor, a youth leader, so forth, they've gone to seminary or they've taken some courses and they've read a whole bunch of literature to try to understand scriptures, and they have encountered different viewpoints, and they might understand that this isn't as simple, right? As simple and as stark of a message as is being presented here. It's not easy, right, for any of them to explain the nuances of understanding scripture in Genesis. Whereas, and respond to something like this. I keep saying we're going to get to it. I think maybe the time has come. Let's do it. Let's do it. And I've just got a few like screenshots, pictures I took in the theater. I don't want to, go beyond this. I'm not trying to rip the movie off, and I'm not going to go through every detail of what happened there, because this isn't me just giving you the whole thing, so you don't have to go see it. I mean, the people who made this have the rights to have you go see it themselves. I just want to give you a flavor and maybe a response to some of these things. So we begin the movie actually showing scenes from before the flood and as the flood is onset. And so we have some views of what this particular director thinks that the pre-flood world looked like. These are ancient pine trees. They're a type of living fossil. A living fossil is a fossil that we have from from hundreds of millions of years ago that looks very similar to something we might have present today. And there is a form of a tree that's related to pine, it's a type of pine tree that is very similar to this fossil. And so there was many times in this film images of organisms that I think most of the audience wouldn't know about, but anyone who looks at the creation science literature would be like, oh yeah, see, they're showing like the pre-flood world had these fossils in them, right? That the evolutionists say, or I don't want to use the word evolutionist, that geologists, paleontologists say are hundreds of millions of years old. But see, they could have just been alive a few thousand years ago. And there's a pterodactyl, right? So age of the reptiles, flying over this forest. There are scenes of massive structures, and you see in the foreground sort of this bowl, right? An idol that's been set up, and here's an arena, and in this arena there's going to be people fighting each other. This represents the decay of culture before the flood. I would note too that this arena seems to have been constructed from a lot of cement. So weird anachronistic images, as if like before the flood there were like some kind of like pyramids, and there were structures that very much resemble sort of structures that are much later, not even early times, but like later archaeology. And yet somehow that was before the flood. This kind of goes with the idea that you see it in Answers in Genesis of how incredibly intelligent people were before the flood, that they built these whole societies. There's massive buildings and almost like cities that are shown in the film before the flood. I have to admit, as I'm watching it, I'm thinking like, well, what happened to that stuff? What happened to all this stuff? Right? All this metalworking and so forth. We found none of it in the geological column. If there was so many people, if there was hundreds of millions of people, and there were cities and there were structures, and then the onset of the flood shows them actually being covered up with water, right? And they're breaking down and being destroyed, but still they're being preserved, right? I mean, that cement structure there, I would think would have survived somewhat through the flood, some pieces of it anyway. I think I'm out of order here. And then inside of there, what you have is you have these buried battles going on. You have images of dinosaurs being pulled around with collars on them, very Answers in Genesis like, right? Again, emphasizing that humans and dinosaurs lived together before the flood, and they interacted with each other, even though there's no fossils of human beings, even though we have lots of fossils of dinosaurs and so forth. But I digress. I already digressed. Let me go back to this and let me talk you through the beginning of this. I already said, why don't people believe? That was the question put to the audience. As I'm sitting there, the narrator asks, why don't people believe? Why don't people believe? And it's even mentioned that um, we're only just rediscovering this belief. Right? Young Earth creationists are bringing this belief back because it was lost. He would say that that's the traditional belief from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but then there's this period of time where basically almost nobody believed in a global flood. And now some of us are beginning to believe in that again. And now we're hoping that the rest of you will, right? We're bringing that story to the rest of you. And why don't people believe? Well, they don't have access to the evidence. I said before, museums, your teachers, they don't know about this evidence. See, if they knew about this evidence, and the evidence you're going to see is so powerful that you're going to be astounded that no one's told you before. And as I said, I looked around the audience and the clapping afterwards and people talking. It was like, yes, I'd never heard this before. This is astounding evidence. It's so obvious that a flood happened. And why am I never been told about it? That really was the reaction of somebody. I could see that on the faces of people as they're leaving the theater. But it's worse than even you haven't been told it in libraries and museums. Your pastor hasn't told you this, right? The church has forgotten, right? Your church has forgotten about this. Well, probably not most of the people in the audience, because most of the people in the audience go to a church where they believe this, and their pastor probably told them to go see this film. But even so, many of those people are like, we've been told that Noah's flood, happened, but now we're really seeing the evidence for it, maybe in a way that my pastor couldn't articulate, which is why he sent you to see this film, right? So the flood is, but the narrator also says that the flood was a supernatural event. Now, it's a supernatural event, but we're going to now spend the next 45 minutes talking about how we can explain it as a natural event, because we're going to explain how the earth cracked open and how the water flowed out and how all these things happened. And we're not actually going to mention any of those things as being supernatural. But we are going to say that the cause of the flood, like the initiation of, or God's plan, was that it was to be an event that wouldn't have happened to the earth had man not gotten to this point. And so God had to come in and intervene in the normal providence of his creation in order to cause this flood to happen. So it has a supernatural sort of origin to it. But all of its outcomes and how we could study it is actually from a naturalistic perspective. Because we're not going to employ, I didn't hear anyone employ any miraculous things in the whole film, other than maybe the suggestion that the door of the ark closed miraculously. And that comes from the Genesis talking about God closing the door of the ark. And so they see that as being a supernatural event. But otherwise, it's like everything else in the film is going to be purely an argument from the logic of scientific method, right? Here's evidence. And this evidence can only be explained via mechanisms like water and movement and heat, right? And all those things are the way things work today that you look around. Because after all, we're going to try to use what you know about the world around you to influence. We're going to use what you know about the world around you and how the world works, the way you understand the world works right now, to convince you that a flood actually happened. So lots of talk about, the fear of man is upon evolutionists. They fear ridicule. That's why they won't tell you the truth. Because after all, if this evidence is so obvious, it's like the narrator set it up, right? People don't believe. Why don't they believe? Because the evidence is being hidden from you. So you have to answer the question, why are they hiding it? Why isn't this evidence that we're now going to present you with, why is it being hidden? Well, that's because evolutionists have the fear of man. They're scared of other people. They're scared of being made fun of. Just like you're being made fun of if you believe in a global flood, right? If you believe in a global flood, you're probably going to be made fun of. And so imagine a scientist who runs across this evidence, but they don't believe God. Do you think they're going to start talking about this evidence, like, oh, maybe there was really a global flood, they're going to be made fun of. They're going to lose their job. All right, what am I doing here? I just perused over my notes again, and I thought I would be able to just kind of step through those, and I have a series of slides. I've got images that represent important points from the movie, like here's the pre-flood world. Hey, there's a T-Rex skull that of course you would just have out there. Bent layers of rock, polystrate trees, and statements about how evolutionists say that that took millions of years to lay down that rock. Ridiculous. And so I was going to go through, all, I didn't, this is just way too many notes for this talk. So I'll work on pulling out the 10 most important moments in the Ark of Darkness and have a response to those, and do that as a separate video. And I'll maybe end again by emphasizing that the overall arching feature of this film is that, yes, there is this ark at the center. And I think people come in thinking this is going to be all about Noah's Ark. And it kind of is, because it's the common theme. But I would say the larger theme is that you have the original destruction of the world, right? The first destruction of the world. And now we're going to have a second destruction of the world. And the movie spends almost as much time on that second destruction of the world, the coming destruction of the world, as it does that first destruction. The first destruction is just a setup. It's a setup to say, like, the world was an awful place, and God needed to do something about it and clean it up and start anew. Now, this last one is going to be the final destruction. And there's not going to be a restart with fallen man, but it's going to be a restart with the man that has been part of his elect community, right? And are going to be perfected. And they're going to be taken out of this very dark world at that time. And so the eschatological aspect of this is really, I think, the driving force of the film itself. And as I said before, this is a dispensational premillennial view, right? This idea that there's going to be some kind of rapture, that the world is just is running down. At some point, it'll be so bad, and there'll be the Antichrist will come. And by the way, the Antichrist in the movie, I guess I really should say this because this is part of a large portion of the emphasis of the movie. The Antichrist is not directly named in this particular movie, but it's very much, I'll just say that you get the impression that it has to do with one world government. All right, that there's a one world government being developed, and it's being developed secretly, and it's a coordinated effort. There are certain people behind the scenes that are pulling the strings on Earth today, and this cabal of individuals, all right, are organizing the world into one government, one nation. So there aren't going to be separate nations anymore. And when you see that the world becomes one nation, that's when you know the world's going to come to an end, right? You know the world's going to come. And why? Because at the time of the Tower of Babel, which is another big part of this film, I didn't mention that before, but the Tower of Babel plays a kind of a big part. Plays a big part because what happened at the Tower of Babel? All the peoples of the world came together. All the peoples, in the wording and the phrasing of this movie, all the peoples came together and were under one government. They were under one rule. They were of one mind. And what was that one mind? That one mind was not for God. It was against God, right? And so what did God do? God took those people who were trying to live under their own authority as one authority, and he separated them by creating different languages, which then separated them by virtue of the fact that they couldn't speak to each other well. And they then became 70 nations, right? And those 70 nations then spread out across the world. And so the big theme here is that if those 70 nations then begin to come together again, right, and lose their nationalistness, if they use their national nature and morph into one, that's clearly the end of the world, right? Because that's the opposite of what God wants. He doesn't want a global government. He doesn't want globalism. He wants nationalism. And so this is well, that's what I said. When I I didn't know that was coming when I went to this film. I just thought, this is going to be a creation science thing. It's going to be about the ark, and a bunch of scientific evidence for that. But no, that scientific evidence was, again, as I said, not even, half of the movie. Half of the movie was this larger idea that the world is coming to an end. So in dispensational premillennial eschatology, it fits very much with much of what many young Earth creationists have, which is like you start out with a perfect creation, perfect. In this movie, you got perfect genomes, right? You have a perfect environment. It's all placid. There's lots of talk about how there's like all the trees, all the vegetation of the world was super lush over the entire world. After all, that's how you explain how you get so much coal. Um, and so it's a wonderful environment that then is being destroyed. And then, of course, the flood destroyed a lot of that original perfect creation. And so today we have deserts and we have snow caps and we have the remnants of the ice age, right? So this world is nothing like the perfection that used to be. And it's getting worse, right? It's decaying even more. Not because of humans, all right? But just it's on a decline. And of course, humans are on the decline too. We have genetic entropy, we have mutations, we're falling apart, right? We have more diseases, all other organisms have more diseases. You see how everything is sliding downhill. There is no getting better, and therefore we need to be raptured out of this place. Whereas amillennial, post-millennial, or especially post-millennial view sees God's gospel message. He sees the nations becoming more Christianized over time. And through that Christianization, right, becoming more Christ-like, there'll be more Christians rather than fewer in the world. And if they have the right types of relationships with one another, it should become a better place in terms of how people act with each other and what their relationship is to God. And in that respect, it should become a better world, right? More Christ-like until his final coming. So that has a more positive outlook on things, and then there are also positive amillennial types as well, where we're in the millennium right now, and that millennium we don't know when it's going to end, but God is working with people to accomplish His purposes, and that purpose isn't necessarily to see everything just fall apart, and for people to become less friendly to one another and be more immoral and all that. That doesn't necessarily have to be the future. But in dispensational eschatology, it's basically, yes, everyone's going to get worse because we're sinners. And there's very little that, honestly, the way I view it is, and this it's going to be fair to dispensationalists because I'm sure they would disagree with this, but from the outside, it looks like there's nothing God can really do about it, right? Because God's letting that happen. He's like, this is your fault. You sinned. You made your bed. You got to lay in it, and I'm going to rescue you out of it, but I'm going to rescue you out of the trash can, right? You can't make your trash can into a better place at all. You can't fix it up, right? Even with me like guiding you through the Holy Spirit. And I think that the Holy Spirit can do wonderful things, amazing things, and can change people. Can even change lives, change people's perspectives. But there's sort of a much more pessimistic view in dispensationalism. All right, I've already been talking for an hour. I don't think that's going to do any good for me to go on for another hour in which I just go through step by step through all the different things that were said in the movie and talk about the different evidences and present different viewpoints and all that. That feels like a different video at this point. So let's just stop there. All right, did you see The Ark in the Darkness? Has anyone out there seen The Ark in the Darkness? Do you have any impressions of it? Do you think my impressions are way off? Did you find it to be not as maybe as different as you might have thought it was going in as what I expected? Yeah, let me know. Let me know in the comments. Let me know what you would like me to talk about more. So I mentioned a lot of stuff here, right? I'm just kind of like, I definitely have gone way off of my little short script of things I thought I would talk about, and have gone probably too far with a few of my comments, but nonetheless, it's sort of like, this is what I'm thinking about. I'm kind of processing right now. Like, what did I see? It's like, and what do I really think of it? Right? How do I fairly respond to it? There's things that horrified me in the film, but most of it didn't surprise me, like I said, from the creation science perspective. And some of the speakers were good, but other ones were like, why are they there? I mean, I can't believe that they allowed Charles Jackson to have so much screen time, because he just, honestly, he just has such a poor understanding of some of the evidence, and he overplays his hand so strongly. But that seems to be on purpose. I mean, it kind of fit with the way the narration was. The narration was over the top. Like, it wasn't like super sappy over the top. It was just too strong, too confident. All right, I'm rambling again. Let's call it quits there. The Ark in the Darkness. Yeah. Kind of wish I had that money back, but it was necessary for me to spend it in order to be able to talk about it with some authority, all right, with some experience, having seen it. Once the video comes out, then I'll be able to watch it again, and I'll rethink about some of the things I've said here. All right, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.